These are the most interesting historical photos and unusual objects from the past. Let's get 100,000 subscribers. Eamon Goeth, former commandant of the Plaszow camp near Krakow, waits on a stool as his public sentence is carried out in Poland in 1946. The man who used to shoot at camp prisoners from his villa balcony now stands alone in front of guards and onlookers. Children in the newly freed city of Nikolaev tear apart a large poster of the German leader in 1944. For kids who had spent much of their childhood under occupation, ripping this image was a first simple act of freedom. Accountant John List poses with his wife Helen and their 3 children for a formal family portrait in Westfield, New Jersey in 1971. That same year, the man on the left would become one of the most wanted fugitives in the United States after a shocking crime inside this family home. A powerful earthquake struck Charleston, South Carolina in 1886, bringing down church towers into the streets and damaging more than 2,000 buildings. The shock was felt from Cuba to New York, opened meter-wide ground cracks that spat water and sand. In 1952, at the Farnborough Air Show in England, a DH-1110 jet fighter broke apart in mid-air at about 1,100 kilometers per hour above the crowd. Engines and debris fell onto the spectators. Many people were hurt and did not survive. And yet the show restarted only 90 minutes later. Doctors treat a young boy for a Russell's viper bite, while his father stands nearby holding the captured snake. This species is one of the most common dangerous snakes in South Asia, and its bite pushed scientists to develop key anti-venom and blood clot tests. In 1938, during the Second Sino-Japanese War, Japanese soldiers stand over Chinese captives forced into a trench on the edge of a captured city. Photographs like this later became evidence of military abuses in Asia. In May 1951, a column of German women marches in a holiday parade holding identical portraits of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. Moments like this show how quickly new symbols of loyalty filled the streets of post-war Germany. On 21 April 1996, a Russian-guided missile tracked the car of Chechen leader Djokhar Dudayev as he talked on a satellite phone in a field near Gekichu. This blurry frame from the missile's camera shows his vehicle just seconds before the impact. A federal truck in San Francisco is loaded with rows of wooden coffins during the Spanish flu outbreak around 1918. That flu wave infected about 550 million people worldwide and caused tens of millions of deaths. Japanese transport ships are struck by American bombers in Simpson Harbor near Rabaul, Papua New Guinea during World War II. This harbor was once a key supply point for Japan in the South Pacific, but repeated air raids turned it into a floating wreck yard of sunken ships. A French commando from the 2nd Shock Battalion discovers a German soldier hiding in a roadside ditch beside a wrecked car in France in 1944. This elite unit, trained for fast raids, often grabbed enemy troops like this while advancing with the Allies to free occupied towns. In 1917, the German mine-laying submarine UC-61 ran aground near Boulogne-sur-Mer in France after her crew tried to sink her themselves. At low tide, locals could walk right up to the stranded U-boat, which slowly broke apart. In 1909, in Baltimore, United States, undercover police officers stand in court with cloth masks over their faces while a detained man faces them from the rail. Photos like this were rare because showing many secret officers together could easily end their undercover work. A roller skater in a bright one-piece talks with 2 Los Angeles bicycle officers on a sunlit street in the 1980s. In the early 1990s, former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev walks through a crowd while a little-known St. Petersburg official named Vladimir Putin follows just behind him. A Soviet Army manual from 1937 shows how messenger pigeons should be carried in special ration bags and chest harnesses. Even as radio spread through the forces, commanders still trusted these birds to carry written orders across the battlefield sky. In the 1920s, members of a secret brotherhood in Latin America pose in robes marked with skull emblems. Groups like this mixed ritual, politics, and mystery, leaving photos but almost no clear record of what really happened inside their meetings. In 1927 in Leningrad, a Soviet doctor uses hypnosis on a line of men seeking help for alcohol addiction. Early Soviet health campaigns often paired hard rules against drinking with unusual clinic sessions like this quiet group ritual. In 1948 in Rome, a blind boy who lost his hands during the war presses his lips to a braille page to feel each raised mark. With no sight and no fingers, he retrained his mouth to read, turning touch into his new way back to books. German troops hoist their battle flag above the Acropolis in Athens during the German occupation of Greece in 1941. Soon after, 2 Greek students secretly removed the flag at night, turning this scene into a symbol of both occupation and quiet resistance. On the 17th of July, 1944, long columns of German prisoners of war are marched through central Moscow, while a Soviet officer on horseback leads them past shouting crowds. The event, later called the Parade of the Vanquished, showed Soviet citizens that the army which once neared their city was now beaten. In 1960, a Fairchild C-119 transport plane of the United States Air Force snatches a small capsule in midair with long hooks. Inside the swinging bucket is secret film from an orbiting reconnaissance satellite, caught before it can fall into the ocean. In 1922, New York, parents used hanging baby cages so apartment children could sit outside and breathe fresh air. For almost 2 decades, many families trusted these wire balconies high above the busy city streets. A shattered German motor column lies scattered along the highway near Vitebsk after a Soviet strike during Operation Bagration in June 1944. In just one night, this escape route turned into a long graveyard of burned trucks and abandoned equipment. In late 1930s, Britain, mothers try out full-body gas masks made for babies during growing air raid fears. Engineers claimed these sealed suits could keep infants breathing clean air for hours if poison gas ever spread through their streets. At 08:59 on 19th of February 1945, the first wave of United States Marine landing craft races toward the black sand beaches of Iwo Jima under a sky of smoke. From above, the white wakes show how hundreds of small boats spread out from the warships in a huge arrow aimed at the island's defenses. In 1943 in New York, Colonel Frank V. McKinless raises his hand as a line of women take the oath to become some of the first United States Marines from the city. These recruits would handle vital office and logistics work so more male Marines could be sent overseas. In 1899, an 8-year-old coal miner stands by ore carts in a dark United States coal mine. At that time, more than 25,000 children worked shifts of up to 14 hours underground, years before child labor laws in 1938 finally changed the rules. A woman sits in a medical lab wearing a heavy metal frame that locks around her head and shoulders while a doctor calmly takes notes. Devices like this were used in early 20th century neurology and psychology to hold the head perfectly still for precise measurements. American entertainer Chris Noel poses with United States soldiers during a visit to Vietnam in 1966. The popular host of the radio show A Date with Chris made 4 morale tours to the war zone, and her helicopter was hit twice. In 1959, Cuban leader Fidel Castro sits with officers at a United States military camp, eating a melting ice cream cone. Castro was known for his sweet tooth and love of ice cream, and he later backed huge Havana parlors that served dozens of flavors every day. In 1925, a woman eats breakfast under a powerful quartz lamp while wearing dark protective glasses in her dining room. Health fads of the time promised that this indoor sunshine could give city people the same vitamins as a trip to California. In 1932, a French inventor tests his amphibious bicycle fitted with inflatable pontoons, pedaling across a lake at about 8 kilometers per hour. The strange machine looked like transport from the future, but it was so unstable that most riders toppled into the water within a minute. In the early 1970s, Bruce Lee films a now legendary fight scene with NBA star Kareem Abdul-Jabbar for the movie Game of Death, released in 1978. The towering basketball player was one of Lee's real students, so this scene captures a master. In 1923, miners wore 8-kilogram steel respirator helmets with only small breathing holes while working in shafts filled with dangerous fumes. The heavy masks often caused panic and blackouts underground, yet versions of this design stayed in use into the 1940s. In 1943, British engineers tested the Panjandrum, a huge twin-wheel device driven by many rockets and packed with about 900 kilograms of explosives to break through German beach defenses. During trials, the rockets tore free. The machine swerved across the sand. A 3-man United States Marine sniper team in Vietnam, in February 1968, lines up a distant target while a spotter guides the aim through binoculars. Teams like this usually worked in tight groups where one shooter and 1 or 2 observers calculated wind, range, and movement. On New Year's Eve in Times Square, New York, a sea of people packs the streets to welcome 1938 under the bright Bond clothing signs. Almost none of them knew this celebration came just before a global war would transform their world within 2 years. On the 2nd March 1938, floodwaters from the Los Angeles River twist a Southern Pacific Railroad bridge into a broken ribbon of steel. The disaster helped push the city to trap the river in concrete channels that still shape Los Angeles today. In 1932, during the Great Depression, an American inventor tests motorized roller skates powered by a 1-horsepower gasoline engine on a city street. The strange contraption could reach about 40 kilometers per hour. In 1890, workers in a United States cotton mill stand ankle-deep in loose fiber as giant machines press the harvest into tight bales. Breathing this cotton dust like snow day after day left many with a chronic lung illness, later called brown lung. Graduates of Yale University crowd into a vast banquet hall for their class dinner in New Haven, Connecticut in 1902. Gatherings like this were as much about building lifelong networks as celebrating graduation, shaping future careers in business. Men stand on a fallen statue of Vladimir Lenin in Riga, Latvia, in 1991 as it is prepared for removal. Within months, similar monuments were taken down from city squares across Eastern Europe as the Soviet Union broke apart. A section of M4 Sherman tank armor is shown after ballistic tests, each crater and hole carefully tagged to record the impact of different shells. Despite its limited protection, entire Soviet Guards Corps fought the war using only Shermans from Lend-Lease. Allied soldiers inspect huge captured German trench mortars on the Western Front during World War I. These crude-looking tubes could lob heavy shells in a steep arc into enemy trenches, making even a few hundred meters of ground feel deadly close. In 1957, visitors in Moscow's gum store stare in amazement at a display of women's stockings, a rare sight after years of shortages. For many Soviet shoppers, these delicate nylon items looked less like simple clothing and more like a glimpse of Western style. Red Army soldiers fire from the shattered halls of the Krasny Oktyabr factory in Stalingrad in October 1942. This maze of broken brick and steel became one of the most fiercely contested strongpoints in the Battle of Stalingrad, where every room and staircase changed hands many times. In the 1890s, some psychiatric hospitals used adult cradles like this wooden cage, keeping patients standing or sitting for days at a time. The device stopped them from lying down or fully straightening, and long use often led to bent spines and lasting injury. In 1903, workers in a busy postal hall sort letters at long tables beneath a circular overhead rail that carries metal trays of mail. Systems like this let post offices route thousands of letters per hour long before computers, making steel tracks a kind of early physical internet. Young Stevie Wonder meets music legend Ray Charles in Detroit in 1962, both dressed sharp in suits and dark glasses. The teenager on the left would soon follow the man on the right in reshaping soul and pop music around the world. In 1963, Muhammad Ali drops to one knee in the ring and pretends to lose a match to a smiling young fan wearing tiny gloves. For the boy, this playful moment meant sharing a victory over the most famous boxer on earth. In 1915, Marie Curie helped bring mobile X-ray machines like this into frontline tents, letting doctors find bullets and broken bones without surgery. The little Curies examined more than 1 million wounded soldiers, but many staff worked with no shielding and later suffered serious health problems from radiation. Engineers in Moscow's Red Square take soil samples from a tall wooden rig in 1932 to plan the first metro tunnels. Beneath this open square, they would soon carve one of the deepest and most decorated subway systems in the world. In January 1944 in Leningrad, a Soviet soldier is embraced by civilians standing by the posted order announcing the end of the blockade. After nearly 900 days of hunger and shelling, this notice told them that one of the longest city sieges in modern history had finally been broken. In 1932, American surgeon Dr. Evan O'Neill Kane calmly operates on his own hernia under local anesthesia while his team watches. He wanted to prove that patients did not always need to be fully asleep for this kind of surgery, turning himself into one of medicine's strangest test cases. In 1958, during Mao's Great Leap Forward, Chinese villagers built hundreds of thousands of homemade backyard blast furnaces to make steel. Many of these clay furnaces burst like this one, throwing molten metal across courtyards and turning about 11 million tons of tools. A United States airmail pilot in 1926 poses in a bulky winter flying suit made for freezing open cockpit flights. Early male pilots flew fragile planes over mountains and through storms with almost no instruments, turning simple letters into some of the riskiest cargo in the sky. In 1961, workers in Berlin use a crane to set heavy concrete blocks in place during the first days of building the Berlin Wall. What began as a quick line of barriers and wire would soon become a fortified border, cutting the city in two for almost 3 decades. Coin-operated street machines in the United States offer short, grown-up films in private viewing booths, 1965. Each cabinet teased 8 tiny reels for 10 cents, with a sign on the front warning that they were for adults only. 4 days before the 1912 sinking, crew on the Titanic test a lifeboat and discover that rusted ropes almost drop it 20 meters to the sea. The captain later cancels full drills as a waste of time, and during the real emergency, only 18 of 20 lifeboats are launched. In 1936, at the Berlin Olympics, Japanese pole vaulters Shuhei Nishida and Sueo Oe cleared the same height and were ranked second and third. Back in Japan, they cut their medals in half and joined them, so each man wore a unique half-silver, half-bronze friendship medal. At the 1928 Olympic Games in Amsterdam, Australian rower Bobby Pearce paused mid-race when he saw a duck and her ducklings on the course. He waited for them to pass, then pulled away again, and still won the race with a huge lead. In April 1912, American tennis player Richard Norris Williams survived the Titanic disaster after spending hours in the freezing Atlantic. Doctors on the rescue ship feared they would need to operate on his legs, but he forced himself to walk, recovered, and later became a United States tennis champion. In 1945, Japanese ground crew prepare a young pilot to squeeze into an Oka, a tiny manned rocket glider carried under a bomber. These one-way craft had no landing gear or escape system, and despite sending 55 pilots on missions they could not return from, managed to sink only 3 ships. In 1915, self-styled rainmaker Charles Hatfield convinced San Diego officials to pay him $10,000 if his secret chemical mix could end their drought. Soon after he went to work, storms triggered the city's most destructive flood of the century. A farmer rushes his cattle toward shelter as a Dust Bowl storm overtakes the Great Plains, USA, 1936. On Black Sunday, April 14th that year, one such storm carried hundreds of thousands of tons of soil as far as Chicago and killed many animals across the Midwest. Physicist Marie Curie often carried small tubes of radium in her pockets in the early 1900s because she loved their soft blue glow. Even today, her lab notebooks and coffin in Paris remain so radioactive that they must be stored and studied behind heavy shielding and protective gear. 1961. On the Soviet nuclear submarine K-19, the reactor's cooling system failed in the North Atlantic, and the core temperature rose above 800 degrees Celsius. 8 sailors repeatedly entered the reactor compartment without protection to build an emergency cooling system. From 1912 to 1948, the Olympic Games awarded official medals, not only for sport, but also for art inspired by athletics, including painting, literature, architecture, music, and sculpture. These cultural contests were later dropped. According to wartime accounts, 18-year-old Korean Yang Kyung-jong was conscripted by the Japanese in 1938, captured by the Soviets, and then forced into the German army. On D-Day, he was taken prisoner by American troops, one man who reportedly fought in 3 different uniforms in the same war. A streetcar hangs over a ruptured track moments after the 7.9 San Francisco earthquake, California, April 18, 1906. The quake and ensuing fires destroyed around 80% of the city and cost about 3,000 lives, making it one of the worst urban disasters in U.S. history. During World War I, British soldiers swore so routinely that strong language stopped sounding urgent in the trenches. An officer shouting simply, "Get your rifles!" without the usual curse, signaled real danger and snapped everyone to attention. Irish suffragette Mary Maloney once followed Winston Churchill for a week, ringing a large bell every time he tried to speak at public events. Her noisy protest became a legend of the women's voting rights movement, showing how creative activism could drown out even one of history's most famous voices. British Army surgeon James Barry served for over 50 years and performed one of the first recorded C-sections in which both mother and child survived, all while the world believed he was a man. Only after his death in 1865 did officials discover he had been born Margaret Ann Bulkley and had lived his entire adult life in disguise to gain access to medical school and a surgical career. In 1938, pilot Douglas Wrongway Corrigan took off from New York, supposedly headed for California, and landed in Ireland 28 hours later. Officially, he blamed a navigation mistake, but many believe he secretly planned the forbidden transatlantic flight all along. Krakatoa erupts in Indonesia in 1883, its ash column towering over nearby ships. The blast was heard 4,800 kilometers away, sent a shockwave around Earth 7 times, and triggered 40-meter tsunamis that cost over 36,000 people their lives. Los Angeles truck driver Larry Walters once tied dozens of weather balloons to a lawn chair and unexpectedly rose to about 15,000 feet in 1982. He drifted into controlled airspace, caused a brief power outage when he landed on power lines, and was fined $1,500 for his homemade aircraft. In 1896, British driver Walter Arnold became the first person in history fined for speeding after driving his horseless carriage at 8 miles in a 2-mile zone in Kent. A policeman on a bicycle caught him, and the 1 shilling fine quietly launched modern traffic law. Firefighters in New York City crowd onto an exterior fire escape during a safety test in the early 1900s. After several escapes tore away from walls during real fires, including the Triangle Factory disaster, the city ordered inspections of about 50,000 fire ladders across Manhattan. An American prisoner of war in an Osaka camp during WO supposedly escaped a death sentence with 1 chilling line to a Japanese officer. He calmly warned that if his body died, his spirit would live inside the officer and torment his conscience for life, and the officer abruptly spared him. Professional high diver Robert E. Odlum was the first person to leap from the Brooklyn Bridge in 1885 to prove that people don't die just from falling through the air. He survived the 135-foot drop, but died on impact with the water, accidentally proving only half his theory. Australia's army launched a bizarre campaign against crop-raiding emus in Western Australia in 1932, sending soldiers with machine guns after a flock of about 20,000 birds. The Great Emu War ended with the troops managing to cull fewer than 1,000 emus as the birds simply outran. From 1933, young men in America's Civilian Conservation Corps earned $30 a month rebuilding forests, trails, and parks at remote work camps. In just 9 years, they planted over 3 billion trees and quietly reshaped the entire U.S. national park system. Commuters shield their faces as a bus crawls through the Great Smog of London in December 1952. The toxic haze was so dense that the city ground to a halt for 5 days, and pollution from coal smoke was later blamed for around 12,000 premature deaths. California's 1849 gold rush made everyday food more precious than ore. Some remote mining camps charged $3 for a single egg, over $80 in today's money. Many savvy traders got rich selling eggs and supplies to desperate miners who rarely struck real gold. Families hurry into a civil defense drill in a U.S. subway during the Cuban Missile Crisis 1962, after more than 200,000 home fallout shelter kits were sold in a single month. Many Americans quietly stocked years of supplies and even planned to defend their shelters. Galveston, Texas was once the leading port city on the U.S. Gulf Coast, richer and busier than Houston or Dallas. After the 1900 hurricane drove a 4 or 5 meter storm surge across the island and killed thousands, trade and investment moved inland, and Galveston never regained its former power. Johnstown, Pennsylvania, 1889. When the South Fork Dam collapsed, a 12-meter wall of water carrying 20 million tons roared through the valley and smashed into the town. The flood swept away houses, trains, and bridges in about 10 minutes, leaving 2,209 people dead and 777 victims still unidentified. Tucson Rodeo, Arizona, 1961. A bull rider scrambles for the fence as his mount explodes out of the chute at La Fiesta de los Vaqueros. Founded in 1925, this winter rodeo grew into one of the longest-running and biggest rodeo festivals in the United States. American C-54 transport plane dropped supplies over West Berlin during the Soviet blockade, 1948. Pilot Gail Halvorson became the Candy Bomber, tying sweets to tiny parachutes and eventually delivering over 20 tons of chocolate and gum to children below. Many mid-20th century cinemas installed glassed-in cry rooms at the back of the theater so parents with noisy babies could step inside and still see the screen. These small rooms had their own speakers and seats, letting families enjoy the film without disturbing other viewers. Castle Bravo, 1954, a U.S. thermonuclear device test at Bikini Atoll unexpectedly yielded 15 megatons, about 2.5 times the planned energy release. The shockwave snapped palm trees 35 kilometers away, exposed a distant Japanese fishing crew to radiation, and sent a fallout cloud drifting as far as Australia. In 1911, German master locksmith Frank L. Korolewski built this elaborate door lock that hides the entire story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in tiny sculpted scenes. It's a fully working mechanism made of iron, gold, silver, and copper. Basically a fairy tale you have to unlock to open the door. Stalingrad, USSR, 1942. Soviet cavalry riders charged through burning ruins, forcing their horses between collapsing buildings under constant shelling. The heat from the fires grew so intense that the road surface softened, and around 80% of the horses were lost in the first month of these breakthroughs. Pure white asbestos snow was sold as a fireproof Christmas decoration across the United States in the 1930s-40s. The same fake snow was famously dumped over Dorothy and her friends in the poppy field scene of The Wizard of Oz, 1939, long before its health risks were understood. In 1927, the Great Mississippi Flood shattered 145 levees, sending a 15-meter surge across a region as large as Scotland. The rushing water raced at about 50 km/h, left some 700,000 people homeless, and forced the boat evacuation of more than 330,000 residents. Ada Power poses in a champagne bottle fancy dress costume in Ireland in the early 1900s. The silk gown recreates a Veuve Clicquot label so precisely that it turned her into a walking advertisement at holiday parties. Students throw improvised firebombs at a Soviet T-34 tank on a Budapest shopping street during the Hungarian Uprising, October 1956. One 17-year-old fighter reportedly disabled 7 tanks in a single day by hitting their engine grills and fuel caps from basement doorways. German Dada artist Raoul Haussmann built this mechanical head, the spirit of our time, in 1919, covering a wooden mannequin head with rulers, gears, and everyday hardware instead of a brain. On meant it as a brutal joke on modern society. People reduced to empty shells, programmed by tools. In 1960, Chile's record 9.5 magnitude earthquake pulled the sea out of this harbor, leaving ships stranded and the seabed exposed for about 10 minutes. Curious locals even walked on the mud to gather fish, unaware it meant a 25-meter tsunami would slam back into the coast just 15 minutes later. Pre-Columbian textile funerary mask from the Chanque culture, north coast of Peru, c. 1100–1400 CE. Thin, hammered copper pieces were stitched onto cloth to form a stylized human face that once covered the head of a wrapped mummy bundle. In 1943, during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, about 750 Jewish fighters with improvised weapons held off roughly 2,000 German troops for 27 days in these shattered streets. They blew up buildings to turn them into rubble traps, struck tanks from the sewers with gasoline bottles. Walt Disney kept this worn 1920 manual animated cartoons by E.G. Lutz as his personal guide while he was still an unknown young animator. Many of the techniques that later powered Mickey Mouse and the entire Disney studio trace back to lessons in this very book. Jewish women and children are marched under guard by Lithuanian self-defense units in Lithuania. USSR, 1941. Many such columns ended in remote fields or forests, where entire communities simply disappeared. American performer Ella Williams, known on stage as Madame Obama, poses with an average height man around 1900. Billed as the African giantess, she stood about 6'10" in tall and toured 3 continents with traveling shows. Spring 1945, Germany. Thousands of captured Wehrmacht soldiers trudged down the Autobahn under Allied guard, stretching farther than the eye can see. In the final weeks of the war, Allied armies were processing so many prisoners that entire highways briefly turned into marching camps. Polio vaccine card from 1962 showing all 3 doses of Albert Sabin's oral vaccine given in a community clinic. Within a few years, cards like this marked the near erasure of paralytic polio across the United States as mass vaccination campaigns broke its chains of transmission. Price, Birch & Co. used this 3-story brick building in Alexandria, Virginia in the 1850s as a slave pen where enslaved families were confined before being sent to Deep South plantations. About 3,700 people passed through its doors. During the Civil War, the site was taken over by Union forces. Shopfronts in Coventry lie shattered after an IRA bomb attack, August 1939, England. The blast was part of the S-Plan campaign that brought the Irish conflict onto British streets just months before World War II began. An Italian Alpini mountain soldier rides an improvised cableway between alpine peaks around 1917. These high-altitude units used exposed zip lines to move men and supplies across glacier-filled valleys in minutes instead of hours. U.S. soldiers of the 165th Infantry Regiment weighed ashore at Butaratari Island in the Gilbert Islands, November 20, 1943. This lagoon landing was part of Operation Galvanic, the first major U.S. amphibious push into the Central Pacific that tested tactics later used across the ocean. German tank commanders of the 7th Panzer Division confer beside a Panzer III in 1941 on the eve of the invasion of the Soviet Union. Within weeks, their armored spearheads would drive hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory during Operation Barbarossa. U.S. soldiers rest in a sandbagged bunker near the Cambodian border in South Vietnam, 28 of November, 1966. While artillery and patrols passed nearby, many troops spent the quiet moments reading magazines in dugouts like this, trying to pretend the jungle war was far away. Japanese soldiers display bamboo and canvas dummy aircraft on an airfield in Okinawa, 1945, crafted to mimic real fighters from the air. These decoy planes tricked Allied pilots into dropping expensive bombs on empty fields, saving the hidden aircraft nearby. Austro-Hungarian trench raiders pose in gas masks near Caporetto, Italian front, 1917. These elite night fighters wore masks not only against gas, but also to terrify enemy sentries during silent raids. A shirtless worker in a Soviet Valenki workshop, USSR, 1920s, drags a pile of felt boots to the clerk's desk to have his output logged on an abacus. In early Soviet winters, sturdy felt boots were tracked almost like military supplies because reliable footwear could mean survival in months of deep frost. Camp David, Maryland, October 1963. Little John F. Kennedy, Jr. stands with his hands behind his back, waiting for his father's helicopter to land. This calm family moment came just weeks before events that would change his family and the United States forever. White frontier boy standing with a Native American community, United States, 1886. In that era, some settler children taken during frontier conflicts grew so attached to their adoptive families that when later offered rescue, they chose to stay with the tribe. Josephine Smith works as a gravedigger in Druin Cemetery, Australia, during World War II. With many men away in the Army, women like her quietly took over this hard but essential job at home. Two brothers from West Virginia, one in an old Confederate uniform and the other in Union blue, sit side by side for a portrait around 1910. They once stood on opposite sides of the American Civil War, but now pose together as veterans of the same country. An American soldier in South Vietnam carries an XM-2E 63 backpack detector through tall grass in 1967. This device sampled the air for human scent from sweat and urine to locate hidden fighters in the jungle. Chinese railroad workers pose for a rare photo in the United States in the late 1800s. They were paid less than other workers and given the hardest and most risky jobs that made the first transcontinental railroad possible. Adolf Hitler, about 10 years old, sits with his classmates in a school photo in Austria in 1899. He is the tall boy in the back row, already placed almost at the center of the group, long before he became a public figure. After the Great North Sea Flood of 1953, wooden paved streets in coastal Europe were ripped open like this one, many first laid in the 1800s. The storm surge broke apart century-old brick roads, led to the loss of over 2,400 lives, and pushed countries to build huge new sea walls. U.S. and Soviet tanks face each other at Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin during the crisis of 1961. For 16 hours, the crews waited inside their machines until quiet talks between the two sides made both columns slowly pull back. Civilians in a European city walk in gas masks during World War I in 1918, and even the horse behind them wears its own mask. More than 20 million masks for people and animals were produced in these years, so normal streets could look like scenes from science fiction. Russian writer Alexander Kuprin stands in an early deep-sea diving suit beside his wife in Balaclava in 1909. He made this descent under the Black Sea to gather real-life details for his future stories and newspaper reports. A medic in a gas mask feeds a bandaged soldier hurt by mustard gas in a field hospital in 1918. Tens of thousands of troops were injured by this gas, leading doctors to design early long-term treatment and even custom metal face covers. Students at the University of Southampton line up in a narrow alley on 22 January 1973, waiting for a Led Zeppelin concert. The band was so popular that only a few thousand seats turned this small campus show into a lifetime memory for everyone in the queue. A prisoner stands chained to a post while an officer raises a bundle of rods in a staged photo from the 1860s. Images like this later helped reformers push to end public corporal punishment in many countries. Jamie Lee Curtis holds hands with her mother, Janet Lee, at Studio 54 in New York in the late 1970s. The daughter was already known for Halloween, while her mother was famous worldwide for the shower scene in the film Psycho, linking two eras of screen fear in one photo. German engineers test the tiny Goliath tracked mine in 1940, a remote-controlled vehicle only 30 centimeters tall. It carried about 60 kilograms of charge and was steered by long control cables, but its slow speed and weak wires meant most were stopped before they reached their targets. African-American students protest the Vietnam War in the United States in 1967, holding a sign that links the conflict to their own life in America. Their slogan, comparing treatment at home with people in Vietnam, became one of the best-known lines of the anti-war and civil rights era. In 1888, Victorian engineers built the diplograph, a machine that let one person write two identical documents at the same time. Its gears copied every hand movement onto a second page so precisely that it predicted copy and paste. But the devices were so complex and costly that few people used them. Children in El Salvador proudly show a captured snake to visiting nuns in 1980. The photo comes from years of conflict and food shortage when many rural families caught wild animals like this to add something extra to the cooking pot. At a fair. In 1885, a man with severe elephantiasis stands on crutches while crowds move past the striped tents behind him. In some recorded cases, each leg weighed around 40 or 50 kilograms, so men like him were paid to appear as living curiosities even though they could barely walk. British performer and strongwoman Joan Rhodes poses in 1952, gripping a metal bar in her teeth as part of her act. She became famous for bending steel, lifting grown men above her head, and touring major circuses and television shows across Europe and America. Glass factory workers stand at their stations in 1937, captured by photographer Lewis Hine. His detailed images of industrial life helped push the public and lawmakers to improve safety and labor rules in the United States. Italian actress Sophia Loren walks through shallow water during a break in filming in the early 1960s. She rose from a poor childhood in wartime Naples to win an Academy Award and become a global cinema icon. A young model with ankle-length hair poses for a shampoo advertisement in the early 1920s. At that time, liquid shampoo was still new, so companies used dramatic hair photos like this to convince people to switch from simple bar soap. Young demonstrators scatter as an armored vehicle moves through a street in Derry, Northern Ireland, on 30 January 1972. The events of this march became known worldwide as Bloody Sunday and pushed many people to take sides more strongly in the Northern Ireland conflict. Marilyn Lovell sits in her living room in April 1970, reading a front page about the troubled Apollo 13 mission while guests move around her. Her husband Jim is still in space at this moment, so every headline could mean the difference between safe return and disaster for her family. The GM Aerotrain stands on display in the United States in the mid-1950s, promising a rocket-like future for rail travel. Built from bus-style coach bodies on a light diesel engine, it looked futuristic, but rode so roughly that the few sets were retired within a decade. British and German soldiers stand side by side in no man's land during the Christmas truce on 24 December 1914. For a few hours they left their trenches, shared gifts and songs, and even played football before returning to the front lines. Crowds wait to cross at 5th Avenue and 42nd Street in New York City in 1926, gathered around a tall traffic control tower. Before modern hanging lights, officers used towers like this to manage the fast-growing mix of cars, streetcars, and horse wagons. American writer Jack London works at an outdoor table in California in the 1910s, turning notes into new stories by hand. He often forced himself to write at least 1,000 words a day, a routine that produced books like The Call of the Wild and White Fang. German soldiers from the Königsberg garrison stand in a huge group after surrendering to the Soviet Third Belarusian Front in April 1945. The fall of this fortress city produced over 90,000 captives and cleared the way for the region to be turned into the Soviet city of Kaliningrad after the war. Vietnamese soldiers on a wooden boat aim a German MG-34 machine gun in 1960. Many of these weapons came from old World War II stockpiles, so gear built for European battlefields later appeared in a very different conflict in Southeast Asia. School children in the Netherlands practiced counting on large wooden abacuses in 1930. Before pocket calculators, tools like these trained a whole generation to do fast mental arithmetic and keep careful records by hand. Actress Katharine Hepburn, holder of 4 Academy Awards, rides a skateboard in the United States in 1967. Even in her 60s, she loved sport and small stunts, often surprising people on set by trying new things like this between scenes. An Ethiopian Orthodox priest blesses soldiers with large prayer beads in Ethiopia in 1935. During the Italian advance on the country, clergy often moved with the troops, and each blessing became a quiet act of resistance and morale. Levi Strauss, a German-born businessman in San Francisco, stands for a studio portrait in the late 1800s. He and tailor Jacob Davis patented the first riveted denim work pants in 1873, creating what we now call blue jeans. Soviet soldiers guard the snow-covered new border with Germany in 1940. After the pact that divided Poland, patrols like this walked remote forest roads in any weather to watch the uneasy line between the two powers. An ancient observatory in Beijing stands with its giant bronze sky instruments, photographed in 1895. Several of these devices were first set up in the 15th century and later upgraded by Jesuit astronomers who brought new star science from Europe to China. Sculptor Naum Aronson shapes a clay bust of mystic advisor Grigory Rasputin in Petrograd in 1915. Within a year, his strange rise at the imperial court would end, and images like this would become rare traces of his world. Young actors from A Nightmare on Elm Street crowd around Robert Englund on set in Los Angeles in 1984, kissing the man behind the villain. Off-camera, the feared dream monster is just an exhausted actor, relaxing in heavy makeup between takes. Soviet gunners drag a 76mm ZIS-3 field gun through freezing water in December 1944. This light cannon was built in more than 100,000 copies and became one of the main guns of Soviet artillery in World War II. A beachside caricature artist sketches outside his tiny studio in Provincetown, Massachusetts, in 1936. Roadside cartoon stands like this were early tourist traps, turning quick pastel jokes about your face into one of the most popular souvenirs of the era. A Jewish field rabbi in the German army poses for a portrait in the 1910s, wearing his long coat and a large Star of David pendant. Before the next war changed everything, tens of thousands of Jewish soldiers had served in German uniform, and many received high awards for bravery. East Berlin in 1963, where bombed blocks and empty lots still stretch across the city center 18 years after the war. The wide cleared strip in front is the early Berlin Wall zone, slicing old streets into 2 separate worlds. David Lee Roth, singer of Van Halen, poses backstage in the United States with his security guards Jimmy and Danny in 1982. Their unusual trio became part of band legend, and many fans remembered the bodyguards almost as much as the wild frontman himself. A wooden snow roller stands ready in Vermont in 1937, built to pack winter roads instead of clear them. Farmers pulled machines like this with horses to press snow into a hard, smooth track, so sleds and early cars could travel for months. 2 young women chat in a shared bathroom at a wartime women's residence in Arlington, Virginia, in 1943. As thousands of women moved to Washington for government and defense jobs, new dormitories like this turned quiet suburbs into crowded 24-hour work towns. Former Imperial bodyguard Timofey Yashchik helps a lady from a car in Copenhagen in 1925, still wearing his Cossack uniform. After the fall of the Russian Empire, some palace guards like him stayed loyal and followed members of the royal family into life abroad. American soldiers rest on bunks in an ammunition store at Camp Pendleton, California, in 1943, with rows of bombs stacked behind them. It was common for crews to chalk jokes or leaders' names on bombs like these as a small ritual before long missions. Holiday visitors arrive at the Goryachynsk resort in 1939, riding in the back of a truck instead of a bus. In the late 1930s, many Soviet workers got rare resort trips through their factories or offices, so even this rough ride meant a precious week of rest. The Japanese battleship Ise sits battered at the pier after World War II, its tall pagoda-style tower shredded by fire and metal. The rough paint message, "No visitors," on the turret shows how dangerous and unstable this broken giant still was, even in peacetime. Ground crews sort through a mountain of empty shell cases under a B-17 Flying Fortress after it returns to base in World War II. On a single long mission, the gunners could fire tens of thousands of rounds, leaving the bomber floor covered in brass like this. Rows of Japanese Koryu midget submarines pack a dry dock at Kure Naval Yard during the last months of World War II. In the later color view, the same dock lies flooded and rusted, the unfinished hulls left as silent witnesses to Allied air raids and the fall of the Imperial Navy. Parisians gather around a car that has fallen into a giant crater on Rue Drouot after an air raid on 9 March 1918. For many city residents, this bizarre scene made the distant front line feel suddenly very close. The daughter of a poor farmer in Arkansas stirs a pot on an old wood stove during the Great Depression around 1930. With her mother in a tuberculosis sanatorium, she took over the cooking and housework, like many children in families hit by the crisis. Cowboys rest outside Bob Levitt's log saloon in Jordan, Montana in 1904. Tiny frontier bars like this doubled as post office and news hub, where riders tied their horses and traded stories long before phones or radio. Union General Ulysses S. Grant stands on a numbered platform in the early 1860s, held steady by a hidden posture brace behind his back. Long exposures made early portraits blur easily, so devices like this were used to keep even future presidents perfectly still for the camera. Jewish survivors of Buchenwald sit with Jewish American soldiers during a Shabbat service in a former camp hall near Weimar, Germany, on 18 May 1945. Army chaplain Rabbi Herschel Schachter was among the first into Buchenwald and stayed for months, leading prayers like this while helping survivors rebuild community and search for relatives. Men rest inside an opium house in Beijing in 1908 with a worn statue watching from the back of the room. In the last years of the Qing dynasty, such licensed opium rooms stood in many cities even as reformers already pushed for a full ban. Actor John Wilkes Booth stands at left as Mark Antony in an 1864 stage production of Julius Caesar with his brothers in the center and right. Just 1 year later, he would attack President Abraham Lincoln in a real-life drama he imagined as repeating the fall of Caesar. Ernesto Che Guevara sits at the Cuba desk during a United Nations trade conference in Geneva on 28 August 1965. In this role, he spoke not as a guerrilla, but as a cabinet minister, arguing that rich and poor countries should trade on fairer terms.